Welcome to Polaris Live, conversations on the US China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. The recent United States presidential elections are being labeled the most important signal for the future direction of US domestic and foreign policy in generations. Throughout this autumn, a select group of international experts have been invited to offer their views on the election's results and how countries around the world, especially China, are preparing for their outcome. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, and my guest today is Professor David Daokui LI. He comes to us from Beijing. Professor of Economics and Director of the Academic Center for Chinese Economic Practice and Thinking, Tsinghua University. He is former Chief Economist and the Development Bank. Professor Li is a leading Chinese economist. Welcome back to Polaris Live, Dr. Li.
You're most welcome. My pleasure.
Sorry we started a little bit late, but I'm so happy to have you on. Listen, this is only the third program, David, after the US presidential elections. And I know it's still early, but how are the results playing out in Beijing?
Well, people are not particularly surprised by the outcome. And actually, people are surprised by the manner in which President-elect Trump won the election. Okay, it's like an NBA final. We were looking for the final shot. However, it's a sweeping. It's a 4-0, 4-0 sweeping win
Yes.
for one team. So that's surprising.
Okay, well, that's fair. I want to ask you, Mexico has just supplanted China as the main source of goods into America. China's share has dropped from 21 to around 13%. So now that's a result of the first tariffs in the first Trump presidency. But now the US is getting ready to put almost 60% additional tariffs on imports from China to America. Your thoughts on what this will mean for the US and for China, David?
Well, I think on the Chinese side, people, I'm talking about entrepreneurs, business executives, and policymakers have been preparing for this outcome. That is for a huge increase in the tariff of China's export to the US. So people are not surprised. People have been preparing for this. And how? Okay, there are two ways to deal with this. People are making decisions in. Okay, number one, the Chinese export are now shifting or have been shifting towards countries outside North America. They are shifting to the Southeast Asian countries. They're shifting to Brazil. They're shifting to certain countries in Africa. They shift to certain countries in near Asia, so on and so forth. The second approach, which is even more important, which I really propose to our government, is to find a way to really boost domestic consumption. So whatever the U.S. Will do, China needs on its own to boost domestic consumption. This is the homework China has to do, and this is the homework which was delayed, and this is the homework that President Trump elect the second term will prompt China to speed up to finish the homework.
But, David, China has been trying to increase the domestic consumption. But the Chinese are well known for their savings rate. They are in some ways the envy of the Western world, is how much money the Chinese save versus other countries. So this is a slow process, isn't it?
Yes, the Chinese consumers and households in general are more thrifty than their counterparts in the
Hmm.
US and also in most parts of the world. That's true. However, I really want to emphasize, as a whole country, okay, if you put the whole country as a whole, the biggest savers are not the households. The biggest savers are the corporates, okay, including
Ah,
state-owned enterprises. In other words, enterprises have been making profit, and they are not paying their sales, the value added, in proportion to their employees. So so
okay.
so the labor share, what they call labor share, labor income share, the total salary of the Chinese economy divided by the total GDP is just around 50%, one half. In the US, it is 75%. So 75% of US gross domestic output, a product, is given to households, whereas only 50% of it goes into the pockets of households. No wonder consumption is in China is not, as a share of GDP, is not nearly as high as the
Hmm,
US. This is a
hmm,
fundamental problem. Fundamental problem. Salaries are too low. Okay, why salaries are too low? Partly because there's a huge labor supply in China, and
yes.
also blame government policies for not spending enough on households. Normally, look at the U.S. Okay, normally in your country, in the U.S., in Canada, about 37% of your income, of your GDP, is collected in the form of tax. And then out of this 35%, 37% of tax revenue, about I would easily say 20%. Okay, 20% of or at least one half of this tax revenue is spent on your households in
Hmm,
various forms, compensation for unemployment, social security, of course, Medicare, so on and so forth. But in China, much of the tax revenue, which is also around 30% of GDP, is spent on constructing infrastructure,
hmm.
constructing city parks, constructing town halls, government buildings, so on and so forth, not on social welfare. So China needs to greatly enhance its expenditure on social welfare.
Okay. But this also ties in, doesn't it, David, to this whole concept? There's some dispute on it about this overproduction in China, because it's not being soaked in. And then there's the accusation from the West that China is dumping the products because they're not sold at prices that are unfair and causing concern on the Western side. So that's not completely true. You're saying there is a different balance that is being struck.
Correct. There's um, the main issue why Chinese products are becoming much cheaper, much lower in costs than what are produced in the U.S. in Europe is because Chinese labor costs, including engineers costs, R&D costs, are much lower than the rest of the world. Okay, that's the major reason. Okay, so that issue has to be resolved. Okay, and how to resolve that issue? The main resolution, the main rescue is for the Chinese government to spend more money on households, to give them more low-income support, to give them more coverage of their medical expenses, to give them more pension, so that domestic consumers are able to buy more, to absorb the production capacity. I do not think, I strongly argue against a conventional view that the local governments and the central government in China are subsidizing enterprises.
Ah,
No, they're not doing that. They are not doing that. Let me give you an example of the electrical vehicles. On paper, the central government promised a lot of subsidies to the producers of electrical vehicles, but in reality, enterprises got very little. I would say at most 20% of what they promised, what the government promised. I'm doing research in this regard, and if you want to know more, it's very complicated. Let me try to simplify. Okay, it's a complicated process for the central government to really compensate the EV producers, electrical vehicle producers. Okay, uh, how they produce. Okay, they first promise a cash amount. Okay, and then they say that, okay, you guys, the EV producers, you sell your vehicle, you give the subsidies which are promised, the central government promised, to the consumers, and
Hmm.
then 2 years after the car is sold, 2 years after the automobile is sold, okay, it sounds very ridiculous. The central government says, okay, we will randomly recall 5 to 8% of each batch of your electrical vehicle production. Remember, these vehicles are already owned by households, but the central government will call back 5 to 8% of the vehicles, and then they put them into 18 areas, 18 sites,
Wow.
1 8. And then in the 18 sites, they will check whether the electrical vehicles are being properly used, whether the electrical vehicles are modified, whether the electrical vehicles still have the intact software. Okay, if say 50% or 30% of the collected electrical vehicles in these 18 sites are not properly used, or not properly used, or underused with less than 15,000 miles in 2 years,
Hmm.
then the system says, okay, the whole batch of the vehicles will not qualify for subsidies.
Wow.
And even if the vehicles qualify for subsidies, the money by the central government will be given to the provincial government. The provincial government will promise to give it to the municipality in which the automobile was produced, and then the automobile company will get the money. No, notice the provincial government may very well hold back the money for 1 or 2 years, and then the municipal government will hold it back for another 2 and 3 years. So practically, forget it. Practically, it's a bowl of spaghetti. It's very complicated. Okay, we are the only people. Me and my research collaborators. I think we're the only people in the world who are able to figure it out. Okay, this is a bowl of spaghetti. Okay, it's complicated. So my bottom line, the fabled subsidies by the central government to automobile producers to produce EVs actually is a myth. It's a myth. It's not
Well,
true.
yes, I hope you'll make this research widely available. As you know, being a frequent traveler to America, that we have this series of books that explain very complicated things for everyone on the street to understand. And the books are called Engineering for Dummies and Economics for Dummies. Maybe we should have a book that talks about Chinese subsidies for dummies. I mean, we
Correct.
all
Yes.
need to
Yes.
understand this whole thing. But listen, let me ask you,
Yep.
U.S. chip maker Micron Technology said a couple of months ago it would invest $1 billion to expand its operation, and I'm picking in Malaysia, right? Intel is building its advanced 3D chip manufacturing in Malaysia. China is investing, or is promised now, committed to investing $36 billion in Malaysia. So this is quite a balancing act, isn't it? So is this the face of what's to come as we go through these tariffs and so on in America, David?
Oh yes, certainly. This is may I call it the mega trend? A mega trend. Okay, the mega trend is that um, all countries are trying to invest in relatively, I would call, neutral regions, politically, geopolitically neutral regions, and use these neutral regions to re-export to various other countries, other regions. Okay, and in this case, the Southeast Asian countries, consisting about 9 or 10 countries, actually are the targets of heavy investments. By the way, the Southeast Asian countries have collectively have a population of 700 million, exactly one half of Chinese population. So I call the Southeast Asian countries for the coming 2 decades the little China, the new China. Okay, the new economic miracle will happen most likely in this region. Okay, just like China did in the past 4 decades. In the coming 2 decades, or in the foreseeable future of the coming 2 decades, I do predict a version of the China miracle, the China economic miracle, to really happen in Southeast Asian countries. So yes, indeed, the answer is yes.
Wow. Listen, let me take a moment, David, to remind our viewers that Polaris Live is entirely viewer supported, and we'd appreciate your signing up to our mailing list, kashmeri.com, and to our YouTube channel at www.polaris-live.com. There's no cost, and it really, really does help us. David, you're primarily an economist, but you're also a geopolitical thinker. That's what makes you so different and so effective, in my opinion. China just inaugurated a huge port in Peru that it helped build. It's the first foray of China in Latin America. Meanwhile, the West is discussing expansion of NATO to Asia. What is all this? How does it come together in your mind?
Well, these two things, I think, very good. Okay, Sarwar, it's very good for you to put these two things together. Most people don't think this way. Okay, but it's very, very interesting and relevant to put these two things together. Okay, the NATO is concerned about their maintaining their military influence in the whole world. Okay, so that's their concern. Meanwhile, China is concerned mostly about making the rest of the world economically prosperous. Okay, so these two things are really contrasting each other. By the way, let me remind you that China still has zero, okay, military bases outside China, outside mainland China. Okay, zero military bases. China's mainland China has, of course, has its army in Hong Kong. Maybe a small troop, a small army in Macau. That's it. That's it. Okay, China overseas. China PRC has zero military bases outside China, and as far as I know, there's no plan to acquire anyone. Okay, China has a military supply center in Djibouti, where many countries also maintain their military supply centers. Okay, so but China is expanding. China is expanding its economic network. Okay, the new port in Peru, I think is called Xinkai. I forgot the how to I forgot the
Right,
English.
it's a Chongqing, I think. I
Chongkai.
forget how you pronounce it. Yes.
Yeah, Chongkai is a very super important port. If you look at the map of Latin America, okay, there are two sides: the Pacific side and the Atlantic side. The
Right.
two sides of the whole continent. Okay, on the Pacific side, there are a lot of economic activities. I'm talking about the copper. I'm talking about the agriculture products, corn from Chile, from Peru, and they currently they have to go through either the Panama
Canal.
Canal to go to north. Okay, or they have to cross the continent to the eastern side, that is to the Brazilian side, to ship to the Atlantic route. Okay, but now with this new port, the whole Latin American countries, ranging from Peru, Chile, and also Bolivia, also Argentina, will benefit.
Hmm.
Not only China. Keep in mind, let's keep in mind, okay, this is a port is for whole Asia, is for Japan, is for Korea, okay, is for Australia, okay. All these countries will benefit, okay.
Right.
China opens up a new road of shipping for one half of Latin American countries.
So that's a very interesting comparison of the two. In some ways, it's the BRI in Malaysia, isn't it, where a lot of the activity is on the eastern coast and then the shipping is on the west. So I believe the BRI is helping Malaysia connect the two with a train link to speed up the process. But I'm going to, you're such an informed talker. We could go on till next Monday, but uh, my bosses will dock my pay if I do that. So I want to start moving into a more strategic. Do you think that? Well, let me ask you this. In the West, the war between Russia and Ukraine is being called a war between authoritarianism and democracy. But the largest democracy in the world, India, does not support the American sanctions on Russia. Meanwhile, China and Russia are getting closer together, but also, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, that China and India, the rift between them is starting to cool. Do you think this is kind of the collateral result of Western thinking versus rest of the world not thinking like the West?
In a way, I would argue that this is a part of a big transformation, a big process of transformation. What transformation? The transformation is for the USA coming down from the dominant player being able to taking care of everybody to a busy player trying to take care only a much smaller core of its countries, including itself. Okay, so it's a big transformation for the U.S. to shift. Okay, USA used to be really economically, militarily, and morally powerful, super powerful. It's able to take care of everybody. Okay, but now the U.S. is more and more towards inward looking, and in the process the US only cares about maybe US plus certain parts of Europe, and also maybe Japan to some extent, Korea to some extent. So this is a big transformation. Okay,
Hmm.
so meanwhile, while US is shrinking, okay, from being a dominant player all over the world to a much relatively smaller power in the world. The rest of the world, the rest of the world uh, uh, are thinking individually, each country. So India takes care of its own interest. India does not want to only follow the US, only follow China, only follow Russia. India is seeking its own independent diplomacy. Okay, and China, of course, is also pushed. Is actually, I would say, pushed to be to be I would say more assertive. This is a claim. China is oftentimes pushed to be more assertive. Okay,
Hmm.
when the
Hmm.
U.S. becoming more suspicious of the U.S. of China in a wrong way, which is the theme of my book, China's Worldview. Okay, U.S. becoming less trusting in China.
Hmm.
Therefore, China in turn becomes less trusting of the U.S., becoming more assertive, and domestically, many Chinese netizens becoming increasingly nationalistic. Okay, and therefore, and Russia, of course, is taking care of its interests. So we are in a great transformation. Now, the re-election of President Trump,
Okay.
Donald Trump, is actually accelerating this process. It's
Wow.
accelerating this
Okay.
process. Yep.
Now, David, we're reaching the end of our half hour, and there is an important question I've saved for last. In the middle of December, Polaris Live will release a report that we are cheekily calling How Do We Make the China America Relationship Great Again? And it will contain the opinions and recommendations of a number of people who are highly respected, like you. My question to you is this. As you know, Polaris Live and I personally think this is the most consequential relationship in the world, that between China and America. If you were able to get a few minutes alone in private with the President of America or the President-elect of America and the President of China, what might you tell them? Just two or three specific recommendations. Any thoughts?
Well, I would tell the new president of the U.S. Um, the following. Okay, number one, um, please, okay, please think from the perspective of China. The perspective of China is super simple. China does not want to replace the U.S. and has no intention to replace today's U.S. Okay, China only wants one thing. Okay, China only wants its unification with Taiwan and also its economy to continue grow. That's it. That's the major objective of Chinese policymakers. So please, President Trump, understand Chinese intention, understand Chinese perspective, and based on this, let's talk about any other issues. Okay, let's talk about economic collaboration. China may make investment in Detroit. China will open up its own market for American high tech. China will open up its market for American all American products. Okay, China will open up its market for investment from the U.S. and so on and so forth. So the two countries can really collaborate with each other, and the two countries are also happen to complement each other in a remarkable way. Okay, but number one thing, please, President Trump, okay, please really understand what China really wants. China what really wants is its own domestic issue being resolved. That is the issue of Taiwan being resolved, and also its economy continue growing.
Now you're in a room alone with President Xi Jinping. What do you tell him?
I will tell him also in a very simple language, that is, the U.S. is a complicated democracy. Okay, the U.S. is not monolithic. Okay, nobody can represent the USA. Okay, so please be patient. Please be patient. Don't take the words of a few congressmen or a few cabinet members of the White House to be the final decision of the whole country. Instead, try to reach out to ordinary American people. Try to reach out to American businesses. Try to reach out to American scholars, academics, and then explain to them what China really is and what China really wants. So that's my suggestion, President Xi.
Well, you've been very forthright about that, and I really appreciate it. We will be putting the recommendations from a number of people, including you, in a special report that will be released the middle of December. We'll try and give it as much circulation as possible. We ask people from all around the world, including China and America, of course, the recommendations that they would give. So I want to now thank you very much once again. I know it's late in Beijing, but you always make time for us, and I would like to thank you for appearing yet once again.
Thank you very much, Sarwar, and I really enjoyed our conversation, and the best wishes for everything.
Thank you so much. And thank you also to all of our listeners from around the world. Please join us again tomorrow on Polaris Live, when we will have the former Secretary of Defense of the United States, Chuck Hagel, who will talk about the same issues that you've heard talked about so well from Dr. Li. Until then, goodbye.